What if silence was not an accident of time, but a decision? Not the absence of memory, but its burial, soft, deliberate, and slow. What if a people once fully here chose to be less so, to retreat, not in fear, but in ritual, to vanish not because they were lost, but because they left? There is no battle here, no smoking ruin, no toppled throne, just a plain of wind-worn stone, whispering nothing in particular. A basin where the earth holds its breath, and in the stillness, a feeling, the kind you get when you enter a room that once held grief. No one speaks, but something lingers. Archaeologists came, at first, looking for the usual: pottery shards, irrigation lines, the telltale scatter of tools. But the layers betrayed no timeline, no sharp end, no moment of catastrophe. Instead, the evidence grew thin like a voice fading in fog, as if each generation had taken one step further from permanence, one step further from the desire to be known. Here, even the stones were strange, cut with precision, yes, but turned inward, facing themselves, entrances that lead to walls, corridors that spiral inward like thoughts with no conclusion. It wasn't a city. It wasn't even a ruin. It was something else. A mood pressed into the landscape, a quiet geometry, a design forgetting. Some say the kingdom was punished, cursed to vanish. But maybe not. Maybe it chose disappearance as an offering. Maybe it understood that legacy is not always a reward, that to be remembered is not always a gift. And so it made of itself a secret, one so complete that even the wind avoids calling its name. There are no inscriptions, no named kings, no myths that point here, not because the records were destroyed, but because they may never have existed. What kind of society builds without story? What kind of ruler commands not loyalty, but erasure? Could it be they were not trying to endure time, but to avoid it? Geological surveys show no signs of disaster. No aslair, no guac. The climate was mild, the soil forgiving. And yet, 1 year, the artifacts stop. Tools are left half-made. Ceramics half-fired, like a breath drawn and never released. As if, one season, they simply stood up, walked to the edge of their own identity, and stepped off. We speak so often of collapse, of fire, flood, and war. But what if this was none of those? What if the end was peaceful and chosen? A quiet refusal to be part of what came next. A decision to vanish before being rewritten. One chamber remains at the center of all, low to the ground, circular, too narrow to gather, too precise to be random. Its floor is grooved, not like a drain, but like a spiral, turning inward toward nothing. No bone, no as, no aikan. Just the suggestion of ritual, the kind that does not want to be seen. Could it have been a rite of ending? A final gesture not toward the gods, but away from us? A place where they place themselves, not to die, but to dissolve? No skeletons were found. No mass grave, no final stand. Just soil, folded gently over the centuries like a closing eye. Perhaps they wanted the earth to take them whole. No weaknesses, no echoes. Only a presence that receded like breath in winter. And maybe they succeeded. For when we walk here, we don't feel awe. We feel hesitation, a gentle unease, as though the place itself is asking us to leave it alone, as though the past does not want to be opened. But then again, if this much can be vanished, if memory itself can be sculpted into silence, what else might we have forgotten? And perhaps the answer lies not above, but beneath. Not in the air, where stories scatter, but in the weight of layered earth, where forgetting feels deliberate, where the silence isn't passive, but placed, intentional, like a lullaby hummed, not to soothe a child, but to hush a memory. In one particular floodplain, carved gently by rivers that once roamed wider than they do now, something waits beneath the clay. Not bones, not brick, not the heavy permanence of empire, but something else, a shape in the soil, a pause in the pattern, a whisper with no words. The layers here tell a story, as they always do, each stratum a breath of time. Silt on silt, seasons collapsed into color and texture. But then there's a break, A strangeness, a layer not quite natural, not quite made. A ribbon of soil that resists naming. Soft where it should be dense. Loose where it should be compressed. As though the earth itself was asked to forget and agreed. There are no tablets, no etched stone, no funeraria scripts, just a smooth blankness. Archaeologists called it disturbed fill, a common phrase for when soil has been rearranged. But here, the disturbance feels too calm, too clean, as if what was buried wasn't destroyed, only erased. Could a civilization write its own silence? Could it plant it in layers, soft and unbaked, just deep enough that we'd stop digging? Not because they feared what we'd find, but because they feared what they might leave behind. In other places, tablets survive, cracked but legible. Names of kings, grain counts, curses cast into clay. Here, nothing of the sort. No stylus marks, no wedge-shaped syllables, no attempt to speak across time. And the clay, despite being ideal for inscription, holds no memory, as if even the material knew to stay still, to absorb, but never reflect. A team once tried to scan the strata with ground-penetrating radar. The images returned flat, featureless, a void among structure, and yet the composition was too orderly to be chance. There were no objects, but the shapes of absence still suggested arrangement. Almost like the ruins of a home long since melted into soil, their outlines still faintly breathing. In one such void, a rounded depression, 5 meters across, they found a scatter of pollen, lavender, saffron, and burnt myrrh. Traces of breath once lifted toward something. Someone, but not a tomb. No body, no offering bowl. Just a faint memory of ritual and smoke. And the question lingers, not why this was forgotten, but how. Because forgetting, real forgetting, is hard. It resists entropy. Even when burned, things linger. Even when scattered, meaning clings. But here, it is absence that feels curated, like a gallery of nothing, like a shrine to void. Is it possible that erasure itself was a ceremony? That this people, this vanished collective, gathered not to build a future, but to dissolve a past? To lay not brick upon brick, but silence upon silence, until even the idea of them became unthinkable? And what does it take, truly, to vanish from history's grip? Not war, not ruin, but a quiet, continuous refusal to inscribe. A patience deeper than marble. A trust that the earth, with time, will take your name and fold it until it no longer creases. And maybe that's what this clay is, a folded name. An origami of memory, pressed flat by centuries of rain and root. Still here, yes, but unreadable. Not because it decayed, but because it chose not to speak. When the team left the site, they marked it inconclusive. The soil was recovered, gently, respectfully, but something stayed with them. A sense not of loss, but of boundary, of having come as far as one is meant to come. A line not drawn in stone, but in absence. And in the late afternoon, as the wind drifted low across the dig, one of them thought they heard something, not a voice, not a sound, just a pressure, a stillness, like breath held in the lungs of the land, waiting, not to be remembered, but to remain unseen. And yet, if a people can shape clay into silence, what else might we be walking over without knowing? Perhaps it is not just the clay that remembers, but the spaces between stones. The hollow of a forgotten courtyard, cupped gently in the belly of a slope, windless, quiet, too symmetrical to be natural. A place neither marked nor named. Just a depression in the earth, ringed by stone that doesn't belong here, and yet has been here so long, the land has learned to cradle it. There is no road leading in, no path worn through the soil, no offerings, no carvings, no gods etched into the perimeter. But still, the basin holds a feeling, the kind of stillness that isn't absence, but aftermath, the kind of quiet that remains only after something irreversible has been done. A ritual, maybe, but a ritual for whom? The stones form a loose ring, uneven but deliberate. Not an altar, not a throne, not even a circle, but something else. Something less about what stood atop it, and more about what passed through it. The site was first discovered during a landslide survey, not by searching, but by accident. A new dip in the terrain, a buried pattern, rising into light after centuries of burial. And then, beneath the moss and scatter, the marks began to appear. Not written marks, but grooves, cut shallowly into the floor of the basin. Some were curved like water channels, others straight and far too precise to be natural. Cut not with haste, but with intention. Cut in ways that only make sense if you think of blood. At first, the archaeologists considered livestock, a place of sacrifice, perhaps, a ceremonial enclosure. But there were no bones, no hooks, no dranillas, only these sloping grooves in pale limestone, and at the very center a small, perfectly smooth cavity. Not deep, just wide enough for two hands pressed together. And in that cavity, a powder, pale, dry, crystalline at the edge, soft as ash toward the center. Human calcium, not from a full skeleton, but from something smaller. Fragile, repeatedly rendered. The soil here resists carbon dating. The rains have leached the timeline out of it. But isotope anomalies suggest something burned here more than once, something organic, something once living. The surrounding stone carries trace elements of antiseptics. Resin, pollen from ritual herbs long extinct. And above all of it, nothing. No esrine, no monument, no record that anyone ever came here or wanted anyone to know they had. And yet someone did. Not once. Many times. With careful hands. Not because they wanted to be remembered, but because they didn't. Because the ritual was never meant for history, but for release. Could it be that this basin held not a sacrifice, but a vow? That the act performed here was a kind of self-editing? Not death, but transformation. Not punishment, but passage. A ritual that left no scar on the body, but erased something deeper, something chosen. One theory speaks of castration. Surgical, sacred, voluntary. A rite of separation. A way to shed identity before crossing some invisible line. Perhaps into priesthood. Perhaps into silence. Perhaps into nothing. But even that is guesswork. There are no tools. No seeds. No myths. Not even whispers passed down in the villages nearby. The oldest shepherds simply shake their heads when asked. They say the land forgets on purpose. And maybe they're right. Because this doesn't feel like a place meant to be discovered. It feels like a breath held too long. Like a ritual that was always performed without witness. Not because of shame, but because of design. Because to be seen would undo it. Because to speak, it would anchor it in memory. And some things are meant to float free from the chain of story. The earth here has healed beautifully. Moss now drapes the stone. Birds perch along the rim. And yet, when you step into the basin, even lightly, the air changes. Sound flattens. Heat rises from soil that should be cool. And for a moment, it feels as if you're standing in the echo of something that has not yet ended. A silence that has not passed, but paused. Is it possible that forgetting can be sacred? That to erase yourself from the book of time is not disappearance, but devotion? Not erasure, but transcendence? We may never know what was left behind here, or what was taken, but the stones still hum with something. Not history, not grief, just stillness. A stillness too exact to be chance. And if silence can leave behind a shape this enduring, what other rituals have we stepped over without ever knowing? There are ruins that scream, collapsed stones that tell of fire, of fury, of something torn too quickly from the fabric of time. But there are other ruins, softer ones. Not ruins, perhaps, but echoes of something that never tried to last. Traces so faint they almost feel like hesitation. As if the people who lived here did not want to vanish, but did not want to remain. In a high plateau where the wind whistles low and unhurried, a civilization once settled. Not vast, not loud, but precise. They lived here long enough to shape the terra soil, to align stones with the angle of solstices, to leave behind modest symbols pressed into pottery. Always the same motif. A seed split open, a line broken clean, a bird with no wings. And then, slowly, their numbers began to wane. The ground tells us more than scrolls ever could. Through layered pollen, midden traces, soil compaction, all show a curious tapering. The footprints of livestock shrink in count. Hearts go unused. Burial plots, once spaced close, become scattered and then stop altogether. Not in a single year, not in panic, but over generations. A soft unwinding. There is no ash layer, no evidence of conquest, no signs of sudden flight. The bones that remain show no trauma, no scars from battle, no malnourishment, no plague. Just fewer births, fewer children, a narrowing family tree traced not to a break, but a quiet closing of branches. Could it be that they chose to end themselves? Not violently, not tragically, but ritually, with intention. Some have suggested infertility from mineral imbalance. A long drought, subtly cumulative. But the data doesn't insist. The climate remained livable. Trade routes still active. Even the ceramics linger, unbroken, undecayed. Tools were still sharpened. Water still channeled. But not for growth. Not for more. Maybe they didn't want more. Not because they failed, but because they finished. Perhaps their philosophy saw continuity not as virtue, but as burden. Perhaps they believed that every people has a time, and that wisdom lies not in endurance, but in knowing when to go. There's a sacred melancholy in that thought, the idea that legacy could be shaped by absence, not presence. That their final offering was not an empire or an artifact, but a vanishing, a peaceful refusal to persist. In the stratigraphy of the site, one finds no mass grave, but a gradual dispersal of life. The older layers are busy, teeming with domesticity. Then fewer footprints, fewer repairs. At the very end, a courtyard carefully swept and left. Who were they? The people of the plateau? We still don't know what they called themselves. Their language, if carved at all, has yet to be deciphered. What remains are fragments, not enough to reconstruct, just enough to haunt. And at the center of those fragments, always the same image, a coil unspooling, a loop left open. Some believe this was the symbol of their parting, a quiet emblem of a decision no one else could understand. Others argue that no society would choose extinction. That entropy, not intent, is the true author here. That what we're reading as design is only nature's slow erosion, disguised as meaning. That we're seeing a story because we want one, but maybe not. Maybe they looked at the future and saw nothing they needed from it. Not because they lacked hope, but because they'd had enough. Maybe they felt their story had already reached its last line, and instead of adding more, they set the pen down gently. There's a kind of grace in that, a courage we rarely speak of. And in a world that often worships endurance, growth, permanence, they offer us a counterweight, a quieter wisdom, that to leave no ruin, no battlefield, no final wail might be the most elegant farewell of all. Their bloodline did not end in fear. It faded in silence, and silence, perhaps, was always the point. And yet, if a people can choose to end themselves without sorrow, what other endings might we have mistaken for collapse? The stone is still here. Long after the voices, the warmth, the rhythm of daily life have left it behind, the stone remains. It does not rise in triumph or collapse in ruins. It waits, curved and low, shaped not like a palace, nor a tomb, but something in between. Something meant to hold, something meant to hush. We found the site half swallowed by a hillside, beneath layers of loam and patient grass. Its entrance was not blocked. It was absent, as though the space was meant to be remembered by the earth, not the sky. We had to crawl inside, inch by inch, into what felt not like a chamber, but a whisper. The walls curved in, not to display, but to embrace. Not to reveal, but to contain. And on those walls, at first carvings, patterns etched with precision, looping like breath. Spirals, grids, threads of repeated motion. But then they stop, not worn away by time, not chiseled off in anger. They simply stop, mid-line, mid-gesture, like a sentence trailed off before it found the courage to speak. What story halts itself halfway? What builder sets down the chisel, not in fatigue, but in quiet refusal? Some say this is where the priesthood ended, that this was once a sanctuary, a place for ritual, a place for remembering. And then, at some point, the rituals stopped being spoken aloud. Not because they were lost, but because they were sealed, intact, intentionally unfinished, as if memory, to be preserved, needed to be buried under silence. Could it be that this place was meant not to remember, but to forget? Archaeologists note the anomaly. No iconography of gods, no rulers, no conquest, just the geometry of repetition. And then the geometry of retreat, the angle of hands pulling inward. The final grooves turn inward, curved toward the floor, as though cradling something that can no longer be seen. Maybe it wasn't abandonment. Maybe it was design. Maybe this was the act of a people who knew their stories had become too heavy to carry forward and too sacred to speak aloud. Not because they were ashamed, but because they were done being heard. And yet, the stone does speak. In its refusal, in its unfinished patterns, in the way it holds space rather than filling it. It tells us something about endings, about the architecture of retreat, about the way humans sometimes choose containment over display, erasure over legacy. We're used to looking for records, for inscriptions and names and grand depictions. We search for stories that declare themselves. But what if history sometimes chooses not to be known? What if its true preservation lies in being sealed? Not because it is false, but because it is too real? A stone that won't finish its carving. A chamber that curves like an ear listening to secrets it cannot hold. Maybe these are the gestures of a culture not silenced, but softening. A people who no longer needed to be understood, only remembered by the way they stepped back. In one corner, there is a shallow basin. It holds no ashes, no offerings, just dust, the fine kind that gathers when no one breathes too near. And in that dust, the faintest depression, as though a vessel once sat there, not for display, not for worship, but for safekeeping, and was lifted once gently and taken elsewhere. Could have held memory itself? Not words, not images, but the residue of knowing, the breath of a decision never spoken aloud. It is possible, isn't it, that a people can encode meaning not into symbols, but into emptiness. That stone, too, can carry silence, not as a lack, but as a choice. And if stone can hold a silence this deep, one that bends inward, that resists inscription, that shelters something unnamed, what other silences are we standing inside without knowing it? Somewhere, far below our feet, beneath fields now split by quiet roads and seeds no longer native to this soil, a river once moved the wrong way. Not wrong by mistake, but wrong by memory. It carried its silt not downstream, but up, against the pull of gravity, against its own inherited rhythm, as if time itself had turned just for a while. At first, it was only a curiosity in the strata, a mismatched pattern, sediment deposits thickest, not where they should have ended, but where they should have begun. Sandstone layers bearing mineral ghosts from far downstream, wedged like reluctant breath in the upper beds. A trace of reversal, of retreat. Geologists whispered of earthquakes, of tectonic humblings, of lands shifted so suddenly the river had no choice but to pivot. But the curves, the bends, they were not chaotic. They were elegant, measured, patient, like the gesture of a hand folding back into itself, not in panic, but in pause. Could it be the river was made to turn around? Ancient irrigation works nearby suggest knowledge, not merely of flow, but of control. Channels carved to guide water gently away from the sun towards shadowed basins. Basins ringed with stone that does not match the surrounding land. Imported stone, heavy, deliberate, left empty. Somewhere in the silted memory of that land, a river became a bearer, not of life, but of removal, of something precious or dangerous. Maybe both. There are tales, broken at the edge of folklore, that speak of a cleansing, not spiritual, geological, that a people once poured something into the water they could not allow to reach the sea. A relic, a thought, a body too dense with memory to be set loose upon the world. Not because it was evil, but because it was unfinished. Maybe it was a ritual. Maybe it was a reckoning. Maybe it was both. And so the river was turned, not to flood, but to unwrite, to erase its path like a brush dragging backward across wet ink, to carry something away from remembrance and into soil deep enough to forget. Even now, the curvature of the valley feels reluctant. Its turns hesitant, like it still remembers being forced against itself. Trees grow in irregular lines, drawn not by sun, but by scars below. The land is quiet, not with peace, but with caution. And in the bedrock, if you walk the banks at dusk, you'll see etchings. Not letters, not signs, just shallow grooves, parallel and narrow, as though something once scraped past them again and again. Not with urgency, but insistence. The path of something led backward by water that did not wish to carry it, and stone that did not wish to hold it. And so, erosion became inscription, a sediment script written not in words, but in motion. Could a people have used a river not to nourish, but to bury? Not because they were ashamed, but because they understood that some stories need stillness more than sound, that to move something forward is to risk it spreading, and to carry it back is to let it sleep. We speak of rivers as life, as progress, but maybe once a river became memory's undoing, a slow and sacred forgetting, a redirection not of water, but of weight. And if an entire current can be turned to erase what it once carried, what else might be flowing quietly in the wrong direction, still pretending to move forward? There, on a slope worn smooth by centuries of rain, in a place where the hills seemed to fold in on themselves like a secret being kept too long, they found them. Shallow, weather-softened, half-swallowed by stone. Symbols, but not quite. Carvings, but not repeated. Not copied. Not codified. They do not match any known language. No script, no glyph, no map or calendar or prayer. Just strokes, hooks, circles closed not by intention, but by pressure. Each one carved as though the stone resisted. There is no story around them. No ruins to suggest a temple. No altars. No burial. The symbols appear alone, and only once. Near a plateau edge where no settlement stood. Not above. Not below. As though they were not meant to be seen by others, or seen again at all. Some say they resemble anatomical forms. Stylized, but unmistakable. Crescent cuts and bifurcated lines, bleeding downward into nothing. Some think of sacrifice. Others think of control. But maybe they weren't instructions. Maybe they were memorials. Castration. The removal of future. The silencing of continuation. In many cultures, it was ritual. In some, punishment. In others still, devotion. To sever the line of one's own blood. Not for pain, but for purity. Or peace. Or power. But these glyphs are different. They speak not of kings or priests. There is no grandeur, no divine echo. They feel quieter, closer, almost private, carved not to proclaim, but to release. What if this was not a ceremony, but a decision? Not spectacle, but surrender? We often look to stone for preservation. But these markings feel like an attempt at disappearance. A way to place something permanent in the earth, not to be remembered, but so it would never need to be said again. Like closing a wound not with thread, but with time. Some scholars have speculated a moment of collective renunciation. A family, a caste, a generation that chose, gently, grimly, not to continue. Not from despair, but from something deeper, something quieter. Something that said, enough. Enough of inheritance. Enough of repetition. A full stop drawn in stone. Not because they were forgotten, but because they chose to vanish deliberately, completely. Could it be that the glyphs were not about loss at all, but about the strange freedom of ending something before it becomes a story others get to tell? We imagine ancient peoples as builders, as architects of legacy. But what if some among them became architects of ending? Engineers of silence? There is power in absence. A lineage paused, not by accident, not by conquest, but by consent. A history with a missing chapter, not because it was burned, but because it was never written. And still, the markings remain. Worn thin, almost apologetic. etched low on the stone, close to the ground, as though meant only for those already bowed, already grieving, already letting go. The stone around them has not fractured. No signs of reinscription, no corrections, just the quiet curves of irreversible acts, fading but not erased. Maybe they were meant to disappear, but maybe, just maybe, they were also meant to be found. Once, only once, not to remember, but to recognize the echo of something we rarely see, the courage of closing, of saying no more, not in anger, not in shame, but in stillness. And if that much silence can survive inside a single, fading mark, what else might we be walking past, half seen, half heard, mistaking it for ornament, when it was always a goodbye? And just beyond those carved goodbyes, quiet, half buried in dust and bird weed, the bones begin. Scattered, stilled, not violently, not hurriedly. They rest with a strange kind of order, as if laid down not by event, but by decision. The soil surrounding them tells little. Soft clay, lightly disturbed, never resealed. No guidance, no moans, just open earth, tenderly settled around bones that do not bleed into one another. Each body spaced as if in silent dialogue with the next. And yet, something is missing. Something more than ruin, more than ritual. There are no children here. No smaller femurs. No widening of pelvic plates. No tiny milk teeth caught in sediment drift. The ostia record thins abruptly. A generational cliff, not smoothed by time but cut, sharply, intentionally, like a thread pulled taut and then released. Carbon dating confirms the curve. One generation, then silence. Not because they fled, not because they died all at once, but because something stopped gently and never began again. Isotopes within the bones' whisper of lives lived long enough to make choices, to settle, to stay, but none that passed on marrow, blood, or name. These were not victims of collapse, not casualties of drought or war or blight. Their health was stable, their joints worn by use, not disease. They did not vanish in panic. They faded in place, not because they were forgotten, but because they remembered something they could no longer continue. What kind of civilization stops itself before the story can repeat? Perhaps we misunderstand the purpose of lineage. We imagine ancestors reaching forward, always hoping to be carried further by their descendants. But maybe some looked ahead and chose stillness instead. No inheritance, no myth to grow teeth over time, no heirloom of grief, just the decision not to extend themselves into a world they no longer recognized or no longer trusted themselves to shape. Could it be that they feared the burden of memory more than the finality of ending? Maybe they understood something we've forgotten, that entropy does not only erode stone and bone, it erodes stories too, softens meaning until memory becomes mimicry, until trauma becomes tradition, until the wound is passed down, in name, in blood, in silence. Perhaps this was not surrender, but mercy, a generation that chose to unlace its hold on the future, to rest not because they were weary, but because they were ready, and in doing so, left behind only bodies with no echoes, no next breath, no voice that mimicked theirs. The isotopic lull confirms it, bone after bone, bearing the same age, as if every breath within that span exhaled, and no one inhaled after. We find no toys, no cradles, no signs of preparation. They did not hope for birth. They did not brace for it. They prepared to end, but not by fire, not by flood, not by forgetfulness, by choice. And still they left no record, no inscription to explain, only the statistical shadow, the invisible silence where a new generation should have stood. What if this silence is not absence, but authorship? A culture that wrote its final lines not in ink, but in absence. A people who punctuated their sentence with stillness and let the period settle in dust. We search now, desperately, for their reasons. We dig and analyze and model and theorize. But the bones do not argue. The dirt does not correct us. The silence does not fill itself in. Maybe it was never meant to, And if even bloodlines can step back from time, how many other stories have we mistaken for extinction when they were really departures? How many endings were not losses, but decisions? How many silences were not failures, but gifts meant to stop us, right here, in wonder? And yet, if stillness can stretch so far forward that it reaches us now, in the marrow of data and the pause between hypotheses, then what other pauses might still be echoing in the bones we haven't found? Somewhere near the edge of that silence, where the bones yield to stone and the stone to sand, there lies something older than names, carved not for gods or kings, but for the sky itself. A sequence of shallow circles, crescent on crescent, counted and paired, etched across a broad slab that once faced upward, open to moonlight. A calendar, though not in the way we think of calendars now. Less a schedule, more vow, not to organize time, but to witness it. Each groove records a moon, each notch a passage, a waxing and a waning, paired like breath. Inhale, exhale. New moon, full moon, arrival, retreat. And for a while, it flows, unbroken, serene, patient. Every cycle carved with care, matched with subtle symbols. Seasons of planting, of drying, of fasting, of retreat. Rituals braided into rhythm. A people moving in step with the sky. But then the marks stop. Not at the edge of the stone, not when space runs out, but midway through a season, in the middle of a lunar year. A cut, sudden, unfinished, as though the stone exhaled once and never again. No damage, no disruption, no sign of fire, erosion, or breakage. Just absence, a breath held and never let go. Why would a people so precise, so reverent in their tracking of night and time, let the sky fall out of sequence? Could it be that they didn't forget to continue? Could it be that they meant to stop? Not because they lost their way, but because they arrived at something they could no longer mark. Maybe the sky changed. Maybe clouds thickened for years. Maybe a cooling climate veiled the heavens. The lunar rhythm interrupted not by apathy, but by atmosphere. A planetary silence imposed. Or maybe it wasn't the sky that shifted. Maybe it was them. Maybe their need to measure simply dissolved. What if they decided that time no longer needed counting, that cycles no longer needed closure, that their rituals had come to an end, and the moon was no longer a mirror? Not because they feared what came next, but because there would be no next. Some calendars are made to guide life, others to close it gently. And this one, this slab of lunar echoes, feels less like a clock and more like a eulogy. Not a plan for the seasons ahead, but a record of what once was. A goodbye, written one moon at a time, until the hand could carve no further. We read it now through scanning lenses, measuring age by lichen growth and carbon trace. But no algorithm explains the silence mid-sequence. No formula clarifies the breathless end. It is not math that's missing. It is presence. Someone stepped back. Someone chose not to finish what they had always finished before. Could have been part of vow. The final ritual, perhaps, was to stop making rituals. To let the moons continue without witness. To let the night reclaim its shape. What if this was not neglect, but trust? Trust that time could carry on without them. That the world would still turn, and the moons would still come, whether they were counted or not. That memory could survive not through inscription, but through the quietness of being let go. Maybe this is what legacy can look like. Not what we build to endure, but what we choose to release. A cycle ended not because it broke, but because it bowed. And yet, if they once stopped tracking the sky because they no longer saw themselves within it, what other reckonings with time might still lie hidden beneath soil and silence? Sometimes the wind sings things we were never meant to hear, not because they were forbidden, but because they were designed to disappear. There are canyons quiet now, where the stone walls curl just enough to cradle a breeze. And when it slips through, gently, as if remembering the shape of a mouth long gone, the air hums. Not a melody, exactly, not music in the way we've come to define it, but a tone, precise and recurring, that almost resembles a voice. These frequencies aren't natural echoes. They resonate only when the wind moves a certain way. A seasonal alignment, it seems. Winter turning, or maybe spring returning. When the light is low and the air is thin, the rocks begin to whisper. Not loud, not clear, but always there. Scholars once called these phenomena coincidence. Acoustic accidents. Wind harmonics shaped by erosion. But some of the openings are too deliberate. Slits carved deep into the stone. Not cracks, not random. Measured, spaced, curved as though tuned. And when mapped, the patterns reveal something strange. Tones consistent across distances. A kind of harmony fossilized. Could it be that someone once taught the wind to sing? Not to glorify themselves, not to leave a monument, but perhaps to forget, to lull the land and themselves into a soft unknowing. What if these tones were not meant to be heard, but to be lost in hearing? A ritual of erasure. Not loud, not public, but private, sensory. The kind of forgetting that doesn't strike like fire, but fades like fog. A culture unmaking itself, not through destruction, but through song. Maybe their memories were too heavy. Maybe grief or shame or something softer, something like tenderness, made remembering a burden. And so they carved lullabies into limestone. Breathable ballads for no audience but the wind. Not because they hated their history, but because they loved it too much to watch it die slowly. So they let the land carry it instead. Fragment by fragment, whisper by whisper, a melody thinned out over centuries until it became indistinguishable from silence. And yet, some of the sounds still remain, trapped in stone that didn't crumble, in grooves that erosion hasn't yet erased. We can record them now, with microphones sensitive enough to catch a cricket's breath. We can graph the waveforms, compare them to ancient scales, try to decode their sequence. But even as we listen, it feels wrong, like waking someone who meant to sleep forever. Could it be that some lullabies were never meant to be remembered? That some songs were crafted not to endure, but to end? Maybe this was their final rite. Not a monument, not a warning. Just sound dissolving into time, a way to unwrite themselves gently, without war, without fire, without even words. Just wind. And if that's true, if they really taught the land to sing itself into forgetting, then what other voices might still be carried on the breath between stones? But some places don't echo at all. Not because there is no wind, but because there is no memory left to move. Here, the soil rests in perfect quiet, unbroken, undisturbed. No evidence of bodies, no char, no shattered urns. Just the faintest curve of sediment, pressed flat by time. A surface too calm to be coincidence, as though sorrow itself had been denied entry. We're trained to read the ground like a story. Ash marks endings, bones mark presence. But this land, this stretch of land tucked between low hills and salt-worn stone, holds nothing but the suggestion of something once here, and then not. Not erased, but withheld. Like a name never spoken. Like a eulogy never given. Could it be this was a place where grief was forbidden? Not because the people were cruel, but because mourning would have made memory linger too long. Because naming the lost might have kept them too close to the surface. And maybe that closeness, that unbearable nearness, was the very thing they sought to avoid. So instead of building tombs or piling cairns, they built stillness. Carefully, deliberately, a silence laid down like a veil. Archaeologists found nothing they could catalog. No carbon traces of offerings, no pigments of funerary dyes, no signs of cremation, no pits or tools or monuments. Only a sequence of flattened strata, layered too evenly for nature alone, like pages pressed shut, and beneath them, more emptiness. Not sterile, but spared. And maybe, just maybe, this absence was the ritual, a quiet refusal, not to honor the dead, but to let them vanish. Entirely, to give them the one thing grief so often resists, permission to disappear. Not because they didn't matter, but because perhaps they mattered so much they had to be let go all at once. There are cultures that believe the soul lingers where the name is spoken, that the dead echo where the living remember. But here, There were no echoes, only wind, moving over stone that never learned to speak. And the silence feels heavy, not like a void, but like a choice. Could it be that an entire generation was ushered into oblivion not with weeping, but with stillness? And what kind of sorrow does that leave behind? The kind that hides not in ceremony, but in entropy, in neat, undisturbed decay, in the refusal to mark the wound, to keep no record, to let time heal what memory might have held open. Maybe this was not a forgetting born of loss, but of love, the kind that steps away so the other can rest. Maybe in this land they believed mourning was selfish, that to grieve was to cling, and instead they offered something rarer: release. No names carved, no bodies raised, no noise made, only earth smoothing itself like a breath exhaled too slowly to stop. And yet, if the earth can be taught to forget so cleanly, how much more might it already have let go? Some structures invite the sky. They open toward the sun, the stars, the wind. They stretch like questions, outward, upward, across the seasons. But not this place. This place turns in on itself. Its doorways lead nowhere. Its windows frame only walls. And the walls curve inward like the quiet of a held breath. There is no compass here, no orientation that matches the heavens. The chambers are arranged not in celebration of light, but in defiance of it. No solstice lines, no equinox alignments, no carved gnomons to track the shadows. As if the people who built this wanted no part in the rhythm of sky and sun. As if they had chosen a different clock altogether. Could it be this place was designed to disappear? Not because it failed, but because it was never meant to remain. The angles are too subtle, too self-referential. Stairways leading back to themselves, corridors that end just before a threshold, thresholds that open only into more stone. Not because they were unfinished, but because they were complete in their turning away. We are used to ruins clinging to prominence. Temples on hilltops, palaces atop ridges, ziggurats stretching into the open air. But here, the structure crouches low. It folds into the earth, half buried even at its origin, as though concealment wasn't a fate, but a feature. And inside, the walls carry no names. No lineage carved, no glory declared. Just repeated geometries, subtle and smooth, like thought worn down to silence. You don't walk through this place, you descend. Slowly, layer by layer, until the air stills and the light thins, and even time feels softened at the edges. Could it be they wanted this place to remember only itself? Not because they feared outsiders, but because they feared remembrance. Because to remember might have meant repeating. And maybe repeating was what they had learned never to do again. There's a kind of architecture that shields against the world. And then there is this, a structure that shields against memory. Each hallway tightens the circle. Each room folds into the next like a closing hand. Not a prison, not a sanctuary, something older, a decision pressed into stone. We search for meaning in direction. North points to conquest, east to rebirth, but this place points inward. It curls into the ground, like a thought folding in on itself, like a ritual designed to erase its own origin. Not because the origin was shameful, but because it had simply finished. Archaeologists can agree on the function. A tomb perhaps, but too clean. A temple perhaps, but without a god. The layout doesn't map to worship. It maps to withdrawal. It reads like a place designed not to be known, not by us, not by those who came after, maybe not even by those who built it. And still, the stone holds. Not proudly, but quietly, almost softly, like a breath exhaled and never drawn again. Could it be this was their gift to the future? A kind of silence we weren't supposed to disturb. A space shaped like forgetting, offered like a poem that ends before the final line. And if that much was built to vanish, how many more places have vanished before we ever knew to look? There are places on Earth where sound behaves strangely, not because of magic, but because of shape, geometry, stone, and air, arranged with such precision that even a whisper can bloom or die. And here, in this basin wrapped by hills, sound does not bloom. It dies. You speak, and the sky does not answer. No echo returns. No yente bounce. Only stillness. As if the atmosphere itself has forgotten how to listen. It wasn't noticed at first. Early visitors passed through, remarked only on the quiet. A hush, they said. A calm. But then instruments arrived, seismic tools, resonance meters, digital recorders. And they all agreed. Something in the air here refuses to repeat. Not because the walls are too far. Not because the valley is too wide. But because the valley seems to bend sound inward, absorbing each vibration before it can become a memory. Like a place built not only to erase footprints, but to erase the echo of a voice. Could it be that this silence was engineered? Not for peace, but for forgetting. A design not of architecture, but of atmosphere. Not because they wanted to be left alone, but because they wanted to leave nothing behind. Even the soil is unusually soft in tone. No hard rebound, no sonic bloom. Seismic pulses fade too quickly. Geophones blink, register, then fall still. Like someone exhaling into a cave that never breathes back. And still, structures remain. Not many, but enough to suggest presence. Shallow platforms, half circles, and strange indentations. Too regular to be natural, too quiet to be explained. They do not sing. They do not vibrate. They simply hold the air like a bowl holds water that has long since gone still. Could it be that sound itself was part of the ritual? Not just in music, but in silence. A ritual not of noise, but of removal. To ensure that no cry, no chant, no memory could be held by the land. That even the final words of those who lived here would vanish before the wind could carry them. We often look to history for the things that remain. The carvings, the scripts, the echoes. But what about the places designed not to remain? Places where even the air has been taught not to speak. Places that absorb grief before it takes root. Maybe this was such a place. A valley softened by purpose. A pocket of earth taught to keep nothing. Not because there was nothing worth remembering, but because the act of remembering was seen as dangerous. Maybe this was a site of unmaking, where even the sky had to be silenced. And if the land can be taught to forget, can the air? Is it possible to sculpt atmosphere the way we sculpt stone, to bend it, hush it, guide it towards stillness? We know sacred architecture once amplified chants, once lifted sound toward the divine. But what if another culture, another thought, sought the opposite? A space where memory could not survive. Not because it burned, but because it dissolved. We don't know what happened here, but we know how it feels to stand in the center of it. The way the breath slows. The way even a heartbeat sounds farther away than it should. Not frightening, but distant. Like stepping into a moment that doesn't belong to time at all. And if echoes can be erased, what else then can be undone without trace? Some rooms feel like they've been waiting. Not for someone, but for something to end. Not with urgency, but with a breath held just long enough to be remembered. In one such room, there is dust. But not like dust we know. It does not swirl. It does not cling. It does not rise into the air when we step into its quiet. It stays. Layered, unbroken, untouched even by breath. As though the air here has agreed not to stir. The kind of stillness that feels older than silence. More deliberate than decay. We've seen dust as archive, the way it drapes over time, softening sharp corners, muting noise. But this dust behaves like memory suspended. It does not fall. It does not finish. It simply waits in mid-thought. Like a sentence no one dared to complete. Could it be the dust here is part of a design? Not the remains of abandonment, but the symptom of intention. What if this wasn't a place that decayed, but a place that stopped? Not because of war, not because of collapse, but because someone or something chose to pause it. And here, even time hesitates. There are chambers like this, sealed without being locked, shallow enough to find but deep enough to confuse. Walls half buried, entrances that narrow without reason, interiors that collect no moisture, no insects, no trace of modern intrusion. Only dust, only air that will not move. And if you sit long enough, you feel it. That sense that you're not the first to enter. but perhaps the first to disturb. That what lies here is not hidden, but preserved in refusal. Refusal to drift, to settle, to shift. We test the particles. Silicates, ash, organic traces. The components make sense, but not the stillness, not the refusal to dance, even when stirred. As if the dust itself has been taught to remember nothing, to never lift from the floor. Maybe it was part of a ritual, a closing of time, not a burial. No tools, no tokens, no funerary marks, but something else, something more ambient, a kind of forgetting not written into stone, but suspended in the very particles of space. Could forgetting be atmospheric? Not the erasure of knowledge, but the soft, slow cancellation of presence. A disappearance so thorough, it instructs even the dust not to betray its history. And still, someone built this room. Its curvature is precise. Not quite circular, not quite square. A geometry that absorbs light but doesn't darken. A shape that seems to fold in on itself without actually closing. A kind of inward breath carved from earth, meant not to hold life, but to cradle absence. Maybe this chamber was the end of something. A room built not for escape, but for undoing. Where memory wasn't destroyed, but suspended. Preserved by silencing all movement. Where the dust doesn't settle because the past never finished leaving. And if this much still floats, if even the air here has chosen to hesitate, how much more might be hanging between what was remembered and what was meant to be forgotten? Maybe the forgetting isn't over yet. And if forgetting can linger in the air, unfinished and slow, what happens when forgetting is made permanent, carved into the walls by absence itself? Here, in a sunken courtyard without a sky, the stone speaks not through what is seen, but what has been taken. Lining the interior, alcoves emerge like open mouths, too regular to be natural, too deliberate to be accidents. They're waiting places, each one a frame, a shape where something once belonged, but nothing remains. No GLYPS, no reliefs, no pigment, not even the ghost of pigment, just smoothness. Stone worked down into silence. This isn't erosion. This is removal. Every surface where meaning might once have lived has been scrubbed. Not by wind, not by sand, but by hand. Patient hands, perhaps. Purposeful ones. The kind that do not destroy out of rage, but out of need. A need to make it as if it never was. We often think of a library as a place of accumulation, of gathering words like grain. But this library, if that's even what it was, is the opposite. A library that emptied itself, not in fire, not in flood, but in stillness. Quietly, carefully, until only the architecture of meaning remained. The shell without the soul, the binding without the text. Could it be it didn't want to be remembered? Maybe not out of shame, but out of principle. A vow, a decision made not in desperation, but in ceremony. As if their highest form of expression was to disappear with grace. Not because they were defeated, but because they had finished what they came here to be. And yet, something in the spacing of these alcoves feels tender, like each one once held a prayer, or a memory, or a lineage of names too sacred to survive exposure. The kind of names that unravel when spoken aloud. So they weren't spoken. They were erased, gently, devotionally. A ritual, maybe, of vanishing by design. There are scratch marks, yes, but not wild. They follow the grain of the stone. Smooth arcs, not sharp ones. A pattern of unwriting. A grammar of subtraction. If language leaves a residue, then this is the residue of silence. And it asks something of us. Not because we are meant to understand, but because we're meant to stand in the space where meaning once lived. To feel the hum of deliberate absence. The echo of a sentence that ended itself. What if this wasn't forgetting, but forgiveness? What if a civilization can choose to dissolve, not into collapse, but into intentional erasure? Not as punishment, but as mercy. Mercy for the self, for the record, for the future. Not because their truth was dangerous, but because it was done, fully. And what's done in some worlds is not archived. It is honored by release. Maybe this is what happens when memory becomes too large to hold. When even stone cannot carry it without cracking. So they uncarved it. And now we stand in a place where meaning once lived, but now only breath does. Only the slow, wide hush of nothing left to decipher. Just walls that once spoke, now smooth, now still. Could this have been a final gift? A lesson? A warning? Or simply a fading? Maybe we were never meant to know. Maybe the act of not knowing is the last inscription. And yet, if an entire library can be undone, what else might have been erased so perfectly we never knew to miss it? Maybe the place we've been calling a kingdom was never meant to be called anything at all. The ground is too orderly, the walkways too deliberate, but not in celebration, not like a city opening itself to the sun. No amphitheaters, no markers of trade, no outward expression, just corridors that loop back into themselves and walls that refuse to speak. And in the very center, not a throne room, but a pit. Dry, sealed, featureless, as though it was meant to hold nothing. Or someone. There are no palatial remains here. No carvings of lineage. No gilded egos immortalized in stone. Not because they were lost, but because perhaps they were never made. Because what if this wasn't a civilization rising, but a sentence being carried out? The shape of the site suggests symmetry, but the symmetry feels cold. Not aesthetic, controlling, like a geometry meant to suppress, to confine. This is not the warmth of a hearth. It is the logic of boundaries, the math of a place designed to isolate, to narrow, to restrict not the body, but the record. And what kind of culture builds monuments without names? Maybe not a culture at all, but a condition. It begins to stir something darker, not dread, but a sadness too heavy to move. The feeling of having walked through a place not built for the living, but for those meant to be forgotten while still alive. A colony, perhaps, but not one of expansion, one of exile. A holding, a living erasure, where even memory was to be served as a sentence. Could it be the people here were not kings and priests, but prisoners of silence? Sent not to be punished in pain, but in disconnection. Not lashed, but distanced. From others. From time. From memory itself. And the ritual? Their silence. Their obedience to being unwritten. Slowly. Over generations. Not in rebellion, but in resignation. Maybe they weren't allowed to leave. But more haunting still, maybe they weren't allowed to be remembered. The isotopic layers show no influx of trade, no mingling of foreign pollen, no diet expansion. The genome lines do not widen. No outside blood, no alliances. Just a closed loop of quiet lineage, running thinner each century until it stops. And when it stops, it doesn't cry out. There is no sign of collapse, no battle, no fire, only a fade, the soft disappearance of people who were never meant to make noise, not because they had nothing to say, but because they were made to believe they shouldn't. A sentence carried not for days or years, but across lifetimes. The slow silencing of a population by architecture, by ritual, by geography, until all that's left is the structure of obedience, fossilized. Was this the sentence? To endure, to persist, but only barely. Enough to be recorded in the dirt, but not in the story. A people who lived in full, but were buried in partial. Who felt, loved, dreamed, and then disappeared exactly as intended. And if that's true, who sent them? Who designed this forgetting? Was it punishment for dissent? For heresy? For bloodlines once noble, now unfit? Or was it a sentence carried out by the people themselves? Collective punishment for an unspoken act? We may never know, but the walls know. They carry no history, but they hum. They hum with the weight of held-in memory, the kind that lives just under the surface, like a breath never let out, like a name remembered by the body, but not the mind. And maybe that was the plan. Maybe this place was not meant to survive in fact, but in feeling. A monument not to what happened, but to what was refused. Refused inscription, refused celebration, refused lineage. Not a kingdom, but a sentence. A population reduced to presence. Nothing more. Seen, but not preserved. And when the last of them passed, there was no burial. No farewell. only an ending that had already begun centuries before. Maybe some places do not decay from time. Maybe they decay from silence. And yet, if silence itself can be constructed brick by brick, how many other silences are we still walking through, mistaking them for ruins? The silence is deeper here. Not louder, but heavier, like breath held underwater. A corridor buckled under centuries of weight still dares to cradle its objects. Not shattered, not buried, just waiting, as if memory had paused, not failed. At the heart of the ruin, beneath sloped beams and crumbling thresholds, a table remains, smooth, oval, too low to kneel beside, too narrow to share. Upon it, a row of tools, lay not like relics, but offerings. Blades, fine as whispers, hooks shaped like questions, implements so fragile they seem ceremonial by design, incapable of repeated use. Not broken, not dulled, just stilled, like the ritual had only needed to be done once, and never again. What kind of act requires tools that delicate? What kind of rite must be performed only once to echo forever? There is no blood here, no stunts, but that is not comfort. That is intent. It's too clean, too careful, as though the space itself had been prepared not for healing, but for forgetting. Not because the wound didn't matter, but because the memory of the wound was meant to vanish faster than the scar. Were these instruments ever used? Or were they simply symbols, a theater of finality? A performance performed only once before being buried, not in earth, but in silence? Maybe this wasn't a chamber of suffering, but of decision. Not punishment, but ceremony. A farewell, not to life, but to something deeper. Lineage, perhaps. Identity, the ancestral thread. A chosen end, carried out not in anger, but in the quiet solemnity of irreversible action. Some speculate this was where the ritual happened, the one no chronicle records and no language repeats. But the walls do not sing here. They do not whisper. Even the dust refuses to gather, as if the very air has learned discretion. The tools are carved from obsidian, yes, but also from bone, smoothed until untraceable. Their origin blurred, not because time wore them down, but because someone did, someone who did not want them named, only used, once, and the placement precise. Each object spaced not by randomness, but rhythm, as though laid out in the sequence of a rite. Not because it was practical, but because it was sacred, because the gesture mattered more than the outcome, because even violence here had a kind of elegance. And if it was a ritual, then who wore the mantle? Who held these blades? Was it the same figure, generation after generation? Or was it one act, one hand, one final inheritance, never passed down again? Perhaps the role was not inherited, but extinguished. Perhaps the one who performed the rite became the final thread, the last to bear the weight of choice. And after the act, no successor, no repetition, just silence, just the tools abandoned like thought. What happens to memory when its tools are preserved, but its meaning is erased? What happens to a civilization when the most sacred role was to end itself? Not because of defeat, not because of war, but because the future had already been deemed too heavy, or too dangerous, or too wrong. Maybe it wasn't loss, but protection. Maybe the ritual was mercy in disguise, a safeguard, an unmaking to preserve what couldn't be named, or a refusal to let something pass into the world again, not out of hatred, but care, because they knew what they carried, and they chose to carry it no longer. And so the mantle was folded, the corridor collapsed, the blades laid down like a promise, or a prayer, and all that remains is the aftermath of a choice so deep it echoes only in absence. And yet, if an entire role can be buried with such precision, what else might we have mistaken for ruin when it was always restraint? There are no bodies in this place, but the ground remembers their weight. Soft depressions in sediment, curved as if from knees, not fleeing, not fallen, but folded. Trace fossils, not of chaos, but of stillness. Footsteps that begin and do not end. Heel prints that do not turn back. Digits pressed into soil, not from struggle, but surrender. not because they were buried, but because they stopped, and the earth quietly continued over them. Somewhere in the stratigraphy, the fossil record takes on a rhythm of pause, a thickening of ashless silence. No trauma, no blast layer, just a horizon of absence, slow, intentional, like breath being held across generations. The bones are rare, but the hollows are everywhere, as if the people who once lived here made peace with vanishing and then let the land close its hand around them. Paleontologists call them resting traces, a term usually reserved for invertebrates, for trilobites, curled in mud. But these are human-sized, and they're not clustered. They're spaced deliberately like choreography, as though each person knelt where they chose and stayed. Could it be that this was how it ended? Not with swords, nor famine, nor fire, but with choice? A culture that did not go extinct, but dissolved itself, slowly, like breath fading on glass. Maybe they saw what was coming. Maybe they feared what they would become. Or perhaps they believed that stopping was their highest act of reverence. Not because they were weak, but because they were faithful. Because to remain would have meant forgetting who they were. Could ritual extend even to disappearance? Not because life was taken, but because it was given back. There are no tools left behind. No burdens. No packed belongings or final flames. No shrines, as though they wished to leave nothing for us to misunderstand. No narrative, no name, just a shadow of posture mid-bow. Even the soil here has a hush to it, its granules unusually uniform, as if sifted by design. A texture too soft for natural wind, but not carved by hand. Like the earth itself was prepared, like a bed made before sleep. Something in it resists being disturbed. Shovels hesitate. Trowels return light. The dust doesn't rise. The field absorbs inquiry like a mother absorbing breath. And beneath it, the trace fossils, still mid-movement, mid-thought, still holding a gesture we no longer speak. There is a kind of grace in it. Not triumph, not tragedy, something quieter, a kind of sacred surrender, so complete it required no monument. Only stillness. And it's here we're left with the most human of questions. What would it mean to end willingly? To choose stillness over survival? Not because the world demanded it, but because the soul did. Maybe they didn't want to be remembered as a people. Maybe they wanted to vanish as a prayer. A final breath, not shouted, not screamed, just exhaled into the earth. And the earth has always listened. And yet, if even footprints can choose not to continue, how many endings have we mistaken for beginnings? There is a kind of silence that sharpens once you notice what isn't there. It drifts not from emptiness, but from absence. Not from lack, but from removal. As if something was once present, loyal, constant, and then gently erased. Not shouted away, not frightened, just not invited. In every excavation pit across this kingdom's ruin, every midden, every hearth, every burial layer and broken threshold, there are bones. Of cattle, of goats, of birds once bred for ritual or meat. Human remains, though sparse, whisper their resigned geometry beneath the dust. But no dogs. Not one tooth. Not one paw. No prints hardened in clay. No curled ribs at the foot of an elder's bones. No gnaw marks on refuse. No sleeping dens. No loyal companions caught mid-weight, watching a vanished hand. Not even forgotten collars. Could it be this was a place that chose not to remember affection? Throughout the ancient world, dogs appear like echoes, stitched into daily life, myth, and mourning. Guardians, forgers, watchers between the living and the dead, buried with children, painted beside warriors, named in records, grieved in poems. But here, the record refuses to bark. And perhaps that's the point. Maybe this was not a place that welcomed witnesses. Maybe it was not just memory they were suppressing, but anything that could remember them. A dog does not forget the way a human does. It watches. It follows. It waits long after time has lost its meaning. And perhaps that was precisely the danger. Not that the people feared dogs would speak, but that their eyes might. That devotion might survive the ritual. That mourning might persist through muscle and fur. So they kept them out. not because they were unkind, but because they were committed, because forgetting was not just an outcome here. It was an architecture, a vow, an ecology. Even now, the wind across the stone has no echo of pads, no signs of chase or return. The alleys are too narrow for hurting. The thresholds curve too low for joyous entry. The kitchens, if that's what they were, lack the scrap lines we usually find, the discarded bits chewed down to shimmer. No dog ever waited here, and if one ever strayed in, perhaps it did not leave. Could it be the silence was enforced even upon loyalty? Maybe this was not a kingdom of cruelty, but of containment, of emotional sterility designed not from hate, but from devotion to a greater erasure. Not because love was missing, but because love might linger, because it might resist the script, and nothing was allowed to remain that might pull at history's thread. Even now, researchers note the anomaly in their field reports. Canid absence unexplained. No faunal evidence of domesticated companionship, but their notes feel clinical, quietly unsettled, as if they too sense that this isn't just a gap in remains, but a silence too complete to be accidental. And if a culture could rid itself of dogs, the oldest partners of humanity, what else might it have silenced? What rituals of care, what soft instincts, what grief was unwritten simply to keep time from remembering? Maybe they feared that eyes without language might still carry the story forward. Maybe the kingdom did not fall, or burn, or starve. Maybe it simply returned all memory to the dust. And yet, if even loyalty can be forbidden, what else have we mistaken for forgetfulness when it was designed? There is a difference between forgetting and being forgotten. One is a drift, the other a ritual. What happens when an entire people aim not for legacy, but for cancellation? Not as punishment, not in shame, but as an offering, a quiet unmaking, a release. We search for marks, always. The lines scratched into stone, the monuments risen high to catch the sun, scripts carved in clay, folded into myth. But here, there are none. No script, no héroes, no lineage seeking to stretch its name across time. Only the soft collapse of meaning, not because their story was unfinished, but because it was never meant to be retold. Could a culture choose not to remember itself? All known signs here point away from the usual arc. No rising, no conquest, no commemorative frieze. The architecture folds inward towards shadowed chambers. The thresholds face no trade route, no sun. The few remaining artifacts seem deliberately featureless, smoothed, symmetrical, without emblem or pride. The motifs, if there were any, are erased not by erosion, but by hands that once held their meaning close and then let it go. It's not that we cannot read their story. It's that they may have never written one. What if they sought not to survive in our memory, but to vanish completely within their own? This was not a kingdom that reached out. There are no signs of diplomacy, no records in neighboring languages, no whispers in the epics of those who came after. Only silence, like a hill that used to sing but no longer recalls how. Maybe this culture did not die. Maybe it did not collapse. Maybe it stepped slowly into the river of its own stillness, layer by layer, shedding self like skin. We call that decay, but maybe they called it peace. Archaeologists strain to name the site, to place it within frameworks we understand. Empire? City-state? Sect? They keep looking for signs of agriculture, of law, of conflict. But every answer offered by the earth returns with a kind of shrug. The shards are too smooth, the tools too unburdened, the altars, if they were that, too undecorated. There are no funerary rites, no war remnants, no boundary walls, no god with names, no warnings left behind. Not because nothing happened here, but because everything was meant to end here. Could it be that a people can complete themselves? Not with climax, but with closure. Not with prophecy, but with pause. The wind that moves through their ruins feels different. Not empty, but decided. Not hollow, but whole. As if every echo has been invited to rest. As if sound was once sacred here, and then made sacred by silence. Maybe they didn't lose their story. Maybe they unthreaded it, gently, lovingly, like a garment no longer worn. Could it be that this wasn't a culture that dreamed, but one that undreamed? Not because hope left them, but because they learned to let it go. Not because life failed them, but because they reshaped life into stillness. They did not build for us. They did not plan for rediscovery. And maybe that's why we found them. By accident. In silence. In rooms with no purpose but presence. So we lean in now, carefully, not to decode, but to listen, to the dust, to the curvature of quiet, to the monuments that do not say what they are, to the rituals that needed no I but their own, to the long, slow breath of a culture that once said, in its own way, in its own quiet, we will not echo, we will end. And yet, if even a culture can undream itself, what else have we mistaken for extinction, when it may have been something softer, something chosen? Perhaps memory is not a wisp, or a whisper, or a cloud of breath fading into the air. Perhaps memory is weight. It settles, accumulates, becomes sediment, not just in minds but in matter. And when too much gathers, it presses down. It folds and compacts, like rock, like time itself, trying to lie flat. Beneath our feet, the earth layers its histories not in ink, but in pressure, in density, in stone. But something here, something in this place, does not follow the rhythm of nature. There's a fold in the strata that should not be there, not the result of a plate shifting or a glacier's crawl. It appears not as chaos, but as choreography. Geologists call it an anomaly, a pressured layer that bends sharply, deliberately, as if sculpted, as if something once living had been gently pressed into forgetting. And not by accident, not by the passing of ages, but by design. Could memory have a weight so literal, so embodied, that a people once chose to lay it down, and then press it so deep beneath the soil that not even time could exhume it? Layer by layer, silence has mass. Across the region, compression patterns echo the same tension. Not a landslide, not a quake. Something slower, something ritual, a weight added on purpose, as if grief, or perhaps guilt, had to be buried geologically, not symbolically. Stone chambers show signs of backfilling, not collapse, not destruction, purposeful layering. Dirt sifted in by hand. Walls reinforced not to hold something in, but to hold something out. The past, perhaps, or the possibility of its return. What if the burial of a memory can mimic the tectonic? What if the earth, in its quiet empathy, agreed to help? Maybe we've misunderstood sediment. Not just the debris of time, but the architecture of forgetting. What once was culture may now be compression. What once was ritual may now be rock. Perhaps this place did not fall. Perhaps it was pressed down and held there, not because they wanted to vanish, but because they wanted to hold their own disappearance. Gently, permanently. There's a phrase in seismology, ghost slip, a fault that moves but leaves no quake, no shake, only silent strain, pressure without violence. Could this land bear such a ghost? Not because it was cursed, but because it was chosen. Maybe memory itself pulled downward like a gravity of its own making. Maybe the people knew how to shape soil like song, to fold emotion into earth, until even the ground stopped remembering. And if memory became mass, could forgetting become architecture? In certain layers, the soil turns unusually dark, not with ash, not with flood, but with something subtler. A carbon trace without fire, as if something organic once rested here and then agreed to never rise again. Not a body, but maybe a story. Pressed shut. We read these layers like pages now, though we do not know the language. Each stratum a sentence, unspoken. Each fold a paragraph of untranslation. Each compressed silence an act of decision. Not erasure, but wait. Because to leave nothing, you must leave something. A refusal, a seal, a density. Maybe that's what they offered us. Not ruins, not relics, but the pressure of a memory so heavy it became part of the earth. We think of forgetting as light, a letting go. But perhaps that's wrong. Perhaps forgetting is heavy. Perhaps it sinks. And perhaps they chose to sink with it. And yet, if forgetting can weigh this much, what else in the ground might not be ruin at all, but ritual? The sky was never violent here. No fire rained, no glaciers carved, no sudden drowning, no apocalyptic wind. Nothing so grand as catastrophe. Instead, it was gentler, slower, the kind of fading you wouldn't notice until it was nearly complete. Layer by layer, the pollen records shift, not abruptly but subtly. A gradual thinning. Trees replaced by grasses. Grasses replaced by dust. Then a pause. Not lifeless but stilled, like breath slowed in sleep. A lull that lasted not years, but generations. Geologists call it a drought, but not the kind that scorches. A cool drought. A dry hush in the air. Less rain, but also less urgency. Not enough to starve, but enough to shrink. To still the rivers. To quiet the orchards. To ask without asking. How much can be sustained when nothing insists on staying? It was not the kind of climate that breaks a people. It was the kind that gently encourages them to unthread themselves. Ash traces in the soil are rare. No signs of fire clearing, no signs of harvest. Not because they never came, but because they faded away before the trees demanded it. We often imagine loss as destruction. We picture crumbled towers and violent ends. But maybe erosion of memory doesn't need to be violent. Maybe it just needs patience. Maybe it just needs a change in weather. The skies would have cooled first. Nights a little longer. Shadows stretching farther. The sun arriving with less certainty each spring. Crops don't die. They just stop thriving. Children aren't lost. They simply stop arriving. Maybe temples weren't closed but left unlocked and used. Not because anyone forbade them, but because no one remembered why they were needed. The soil here doesn't show famine, but does show pause, a stillness in the strata, a consistency that speaks not of abundance, but of suspension. Entropy applied like a climate. And what is drought, if not a kind of forgetting? Not a theft, but a soft unmaking. As if the earth itself had agreed. Let us lower the volume now. Let's reduce the echo. In surrounding regions, civilizations responded to drought with canals, terraces, prayers. Here nothing. No expansion. No effort. Only a narrowing. A quieting. As if they didn't want to fight the forgetting. As if they recognized it, not as punishment but invitation. Could it be the drought was not a disaster, but a mirror? Not because they failed to adapt, but because they chose not to, because what was slowly being asked of them, to live with less, to expect less, to become less, was not unwelcome. Maybe they had been waiting for an excuse. Maybe the land gave it to them. To step down, to go still, to leave quietly, without drama. And if so, then maybe climate wasn't the cause, but the companion. A co-conspirator in the ritual of ending. One layer of pollen speaks louder than the rest. A strange density. A single species blooming heavily where there should have been diversity. An invasive tree, thorned and stubborn. Not planted, spread by wind. And still, no signs that they cut it back. No resistance. Only witness. Maybe they watched the land forget itself and felt it was fair. Felt that it was time. What if forgetting is easier when the world agrees to help? When the sky dims a little sooner. When the rain visits a little less. When the seeds don't answer, but don't rebel either. Could such cooperation be called climate? Or is it ceremony? The final sediment layers of this site are pale. Finer. As if carried in by air, not by flood. Dust, not mud. And then nothing. No new topsoil. No disturbance. Just a stillness so complete, even the earth stopped turning it over. A long, cool quiet. As if the world, like the people, had decided not to remember. And yet, if even the weather can be a partner in forgetting, what else have we mistaken for fate, when it may have been permission? And deeper still, beneath the wind-stilled dust, a warmth long gone, but not forgotten. Not by the stones, not by the soil. Charcoal, but not scattered as if by chaos. Not blown from a hearth, nor clumped from an ancient kiln. These are quiet marks. Spirals. Always spirals. No ash, no collapsed timber, no signs of collapse or defense. Just coiled black signatures, pressed into the strata like fingerprints left by a patient fire. What kind of flame does not rage? What kind of fire refuses to spread? Not because it was too weak, but because it was instructed not to. Maybe it was never meant to warm, or illuminate, or destroy. Maybe it was fire meant only to release, to erase. The spirals vary in width, but not in direction, always curling inward, as though something were being drawn in, drawn down, not flared outward like a beacon, but inward like a hush. Could it be the fires were not lit for others to see, but so that something might never be seen again? Perhaps these flames were not fed by wood, but by memory. No tools nearby, no clay pot scorched, no bones seared, just fine powder where fuel should be. Pulverized, purposefully sifted, as if someone, or many, had taken great care to ensure what burned left no shape behind. Some fire scream. These whispered. In some corners of the ruin, the spiral marks overlap. Not random, but rhythmic. Layered like verses in a song no one was meant to hear twice. A quiet chant in heat and silence. And just beyond smooth walls, polished where inscriptions might once have been. Scrubbed not by time, but by resolve. What if these were fires lit, not for punishment, but for release? Not because the people feared what they had written, but because they no longer needed it spoken aloud. Because the meaning had already been absorbed, lived, not kept. Maybe the spiral was not a symbol, but a verb, a letting go. The oldest of them are shallow, barely present, as if the heat hadn't been enough, as if the ritual was being learned slowly through trial. Later spirals burn deeper, finer, controlled, mastered, not accidental, refined. We often think of fire as a wild thing, devourer, rebel, purifier. But what if here it was obedient? What if it knelt? And what does it mean to teach fire how to forget? Sediment samples show no soot spread beyond the spiral's edge. No plume de rift. The air didn't carry it. The smoke was contained, or suppressed. The flame, perhaps, folded in on itself, like a secret, or prayer. Could it be this wasn't cremation, but concealment? A burial not of bodies, but of thought? Maybe the fire was fed pages, not people. Vows, not flesh. Some linguists speculate the spiral marks may be thermal echoes, the remnants of bound fibers burned in motion, like scrolls rotated as they vanished. Turned not by accident, but by hand, carefully, reverently. A reading through release. A recitation that ends in silence. Not because it was forbidden, but because it was complete. And then, in the outer corridors, traces of the same spirals appear again. Faint, smaller. Repeated, but misaligned, as if done by someone younger. Remembering not the fire, but its rhythm. The memory of forgetting. A ritual repeated, not to preserve the past, but to carry the act of letting it go. And what kind of culture inherits the act of erasure? What kind of lineage leaves flame where others leave names? Perhaps one that believes in memory as a burden, or a debt, or a kind of gravity that must eventually be exhaled, not because it was too heavy, but because it had already served its weight. And in the center of the spiral field, a single stone, singed only once, never moved. No inscription, no altar, just stillness. The eye of a spiral, maybe the last place memory rested before it agreed to be unmade. And yet, if forgetting can be taught to fire, what else might we think is lost that was never meant to remain? And somewhere between fire and flesh, between memory and marrow, there is a place where lineage falters, not abruptly, but gently, quietly, the way fog fades into air, not vanishing, only ceasing to hold shape. In the deep genetic residues beneath the southern quarter of the ruin, something odd lingers. A hum in the helix, a pattern interrupted, not by disease, not by migration, but by decision. A long, slow softening of the line. Generation tapering, not breaking. The bones are healthy, strong, adult, but nearly all are from the same span of life. No children, no elders, no adolescents frozen in transition. As if the story of the body here was edited, trimmed at the ends. Not because the people fled, but because the future was declined. Fertility markers in the samples suggest deliberate inhibition. A chemical footprint, subtle, consistent, and too precise for nature to claim. Not a poison, not violence, more like permission withdrawn. Maybe the body obeyed because it was asked to. Could be they agreed. The glyphs carved nearest to the burial chambers, where they exist at all, carry strange, looping signatures. Not names, not titles, just mirrored shapes, reflections of themselves, not of others. Symbols that face inward, not outward. Not declarations, but quiet folds. Not because the people were proud, but because they were done. Maybe lineage here wasn't broken. Maybe it was released. And what kind of culture steps back from itself so gently? What kind of people decide, with ceremony and calm, not to be continued? We think of endings as acts of desperation. Collapse, conquest, extinction. But there is another kind of vanishing, one without smoke, without mourning, a silence so complete it does not echo because it was never thrown. No battle, no famine, no natural disaster, just a gentle refusal to proceed. What if identity here became the weight? Not because it was hated, but because it was complete, because there was nothing left to carry forward that hadn't already been understood. In one chamber, skeletal remains are aligned with deliberate symmetry, each body placed in mirrored rest, one beside another, shoulder to shoulder, spine to spine. Not interred with markers, but with sameness, clarity, like pages of the same book, closed. DNA tests reveal near-identical profiles. Siblings, cousins, or perhaps not. Perhaps something more complex. Engineered, maybe not by machines but by choice. And that choice may not have been to control life, but to complete it, not through erasure, but through stillness. What if, for this people, continuation was the stranger act? What if reproduction, the impulse to remain, was seen not as sacred, but indulgent? Could it be that the future was not feared, but simply not required? Maybe their rituals were about inheritance, not of blood, but of silence. And so they passed it on, not through children, but through echo. The echo of a decision never shouted. The echo of a people who left not names, but intentions. And over time, as the body became still, the land responded in kind. Pollen records show a decline, not in abundance, but in variation. Crops simplified. Orchards pruned not to grow more, but to grow enough. A landscape edited, not starved. Maintained like memory, until memory, too, was no longer necessary. This was not entropy. This was design. This was not collapse. This was curation. A civilization not interrupted, but completed. And yet, if identity can be set down like a cloak, if memory can be taught to vanish, if even fire can be asked to whisper, then what else might remain beneath our feet? Not buried, but resting. Not lost, but released. And beneath those resting layers, beneath the long hush of lineage laid to sleep, there emerges a still, stranger silence, the silence of things never called. Here, the stones are smooth, not from weather, not from wear, but from restraint. No words chiseled, no stories coaxed into permanence. No pictographs, no pantheon etched in celebration or warning. Just structure, form, shape without language, mass without myth. Not because they couldn't speak, but because they chose not to inscribe. Even the animals, those that roamed the fringes or were buried in bone near hearths, bear no markers of affection. No sacred glyphs beside the remains of a companion. No ochre-painted paw prints. No ceremonial collars carved from shell or tooth. It's as if the very notion of naming was left behind, maybe forbidden, or maybe never needed. Could it be they believed names were cages? Could it be to name a thing was to claim it, to hold it still, to trap it in echo? Maybe they wished instead to live in things as they were, unfixed, in motion, like wind through doorless halls. And if so, then what kind of people refuse to speak permanence into anything? We search for kings in buried rings, for gods in high relief. But here, there are neither. No emblems of royalty. No ancestral line marked in seal or scepter. No divine figurines tucked beneath thresholds. No thunder animals, no moon-eyed watchers, no idols buried for protection. This was not a place of possession. It may not even have been a place of belief, at least not the kind that asks the world to remember it. And yet, something lived here. Something thought. Something built. The halls curved not by accident. The angles of the walls, not ornamental but harmonic. Aligned with celestial cycles, yes, but never told, never explained. The alignment lives in stone alone, like a secret meant to be known only by standing inside it. Not written, not repeated, just felt. And perhaps that was the point. Perhaps naming, here, was seen as rupture, as trespass. To say aloud was to sever. To observe was enough. The absence of words is not always the absence of meaning. Sometimes silence is devotion. In the lower chambers, there are alcoves, narrow, deep, smoothed by generations of hands. No plaques, no scripts, just space, for sitting, or kneeling, or listening, for not filling the air with thought, but allowing the air to settle around it. What if prayer here was not addressed, but dissolved? What if reverence meant leaving nothing behind? Even the soil agrees. In layers where we'd expect a people to rise. Into myth, into monument, into continuity, we find instead a soft leveling. A sediment that does not accumulate in conquest, but presses gently down. Flattening names into nothing. Equalizing noise into rest. Not because they were erased, but because they never sought to be named in the first place. It's a strange kind of courage to live without echo. To rise without anthem, to vanish without inscription. And yet, could this be the clearest voice of all? To let a life be lived without carving it into stone? To build, not for glory, but for the gentle vanishing of self? Maybe, in this kingdom, language was not meant to record. Maybe it was meant to be released, spoken only in breath, heard only once, meant only for those present in the moment. Not because they feared memory, but because they honored its transience. A culture that names nothing does not fear being forgotten. It simply does not require being remembered. And so we wander their quiet structures now, whispering questions they never asked aloud, projecting meanings into their unmarked rooms, trying to fill in what they so carefully left blank. But what if the blankness is the message? What if meaning was not missed, but intentionally unspoken? And yet, if a civilization can live without naming, without kings, without gods or words, then what else might be true, even when no one speaks it? And just beyond that unspoken truth, beneath the layers of quiet stone and abandoned meaning, lies something harder, darker, colder, a single shard, obsidian, black glass, not dull with time, but still sharp, as if untouched by it, as if waiting. It was found not in the upper strata where daily life had passed, nor in the sacred hollows where silence nested like birds in rafters, but at the very bottom, the base of the ruin, the terminus of a dig, the last known moment before the ground says nothing more. Not buried with purpose, not placed in ritual, it simply was there, alone, smooth on all sides except one. That side, cleft, deliberate. The fracture is clean, as though snapped in resistance. Or decision. No script, no icon, no hint of who held it, or what it once cut through. It does not speak of use. It speaks of gesture, and that gesture feels final. But not as in death, not as an end, not exactly. More like closure denied, a conclusion that leaves no record because it was never meant to begin one. We often think of history as layers that stack upward, that empires bloom from ashes, that rituals ripple from some origin story like rings in water. But what if, instead, this shard was the center? Not the result, but the cause? Not the last thing made, but the first thing erased? In obsidian cultures across the ancient world, from Anatolia to Mesoamerica, black glass was not just material, but metaphor. It stood for mirrors, for portals, for truth too dangerous to keep visible. Blades that could reflect just as easily as they cut. So what kind of people leave behind one blade, unmarked? Maybe it wasn't meant to survive. Maybe nothing was. And maybe that was the point. We dig to remember. But what happens when we find the tool used to forget? The shard lies at the depth where names run out, where maps no longer match topography, where chronology buckles, not from erosion, but from absence, like something pulled its own roots from the earth and then dusted over the hole. Not because it was hunted, but because it no longer wanted to be found. Not by accident, but by authorship. We can measure the surrounding soil, silty, undisturbed. We can count the pollen grains, fewer, sparser, colder. We can test the carbon trace. No recent burn, no flood, no collapse. The past didn't fall here. It faded, willingly. And this shard, this sharp pause, might have been the punctuation, like a final thought etched in silence, offered to no one. Not a marker of defeat, but of refusal. Not surrender, but stepping away. What kind of culture chooses erasure? What kind of people design their own forgetting? Perhaps those who had already remembered too much. Or perhaps those who believed memory was no longer theirs to carry. It's hard to say, because this is not a place where saying was valued. It's a place where unsaying ruled. We call it the chronicle that ends before it begins. But maybe there was no chronicle. Maybe this was the warning, that not all stories need be told, that some civilizations find clarity not in inscription, but in the clean absence of it. Still, we try to make sense. We hold a shard in gloved hands. We scan its edges for use wear. We photograph it under ultraviolet light. We test it for blood, for soot, for script, but it yields nothing, as though even its atoms refuse to remember. Could it be this was not an object of violence, but of peace? Could it be this was not a weapon, but a decision? To remain unnamed, to end before beginning, to let history sigh and pass by. And yet, if an entire world can vanish by choice, who decides what stories deserve to stay?